no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the live stream exploration for the Restitutor Orbis channel, where we're going to be looking at the 1960s. It's good to see everybody, and I want to go off and give those customary hellos. So hello, Kathy. Hello, Audi. Hello, Peter. Hello, Polly. Hey, Sovereign, Invisible, Untraceable. Good to see you. Crypnotic, welcome. Hey, Polly. Sheepdog, good to see you. Hi, Sky Sage. Chassis, always good to see you. Don Don. Hey, Random FX, thank you, and thank you for not hammering me for my American English. Who else have we got? Jamie, good to see you, brother. Shangly, welcome. Sheepdog, thanks for joining us. Remember the future, thank you for joining us. Who else have we got? Have I not said hello to yet? I think that's it. Hey, Tara, if you're still there. Looks like we got a lot of people that are still joining us. Hey, Thrax, welcome. Quincy, thank you for joining us. Hey, Robert, good to see you as always. Quantum Paradox, welcome. Kelbell, thanks for joining us. Subtle B, good to see you. Jason, thank you for joining us. Steve, welcome. I appreciate that. All right, so as everybody's getting logged in, here's what we're going to do for this exploration. We're going to be looking at the 1960s, but this isn't going to be exactly like what we did when we looked at the 1980s, and here's the reason. In the 1980s, what we were really looking at was the power of the popular culture. You know, there were some people, hey, Renee, good to see you. There were some people that said, you know, you spent the whole exploration looking more at the pop culture, and that's true, we did. And the reason for that is because the 1980s, that's what's remembered from it, is the power of the popular culture. And in many ways, it endures to this day. Why do we think we have so many remakes? Now, yes, we have remakes from other time frames, other decades, but the 1980s, that's where it starts from. Hey, Shelby, good to see you. So what we're going to look at with the 1960s is we're going to understand how, in our framework and from the current timeline that we think that we're on, reality bending really began in the 1960s. And we're going to look at several different aspects of the 1960s. I'll give a little presentation, show some images, and then at the end of each little presentation, we'll talk about it and see what you think on what we presented from the 1960s. You could really say that there's some connections between the 1980s and the 1960s in many ways. I mean, many of the things that we referenced in the popular culture in the 1980s actually had their start in the 1960s. No, Star Wars didn't, but Star Trek did, and Doctor Who did. And many of the aspects of music and other things came up in the 1980s that started in the 1960s. So I think it's very fitting. Thank you, Tara. I really appreciate that. Hope things are going well in the magical land of Hawaii. Oh, yeah. Don't worry, Sky Sage. We're going to talk about it all. And Lori, thanks for joining us. So let's just dive right on in here. And the first we're going to start with is the history of the 1960s. And what was the history of the 1960s all about? And what did we really come across in it? And so the first image to show you, the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War, we're talking about another war, and this goes back into the whole concept of conflict, assimilation, indoctrination, one of the channel's themes. And so why does everything always start with a war? And why is the Vietnam War so profound? Why did it become such a part of the society, the civilization, and really the culture of the 1960s? Well, if you think about all the driving events and the entire identity of the 1960s, and not just the United States, the Vietnam War had a profound effect on the entire land. Whether a nation took part in it or not, many of the policies that were being played out, the Vietnam War was basically the theater, if you will, and that's a very bad term for it, but it was the area where they were playing out the Cold War, or at least playing out what we were supposed to see. Good comment there from Chassis. Yeah, that's the American way. Absolutely right. I mean, that is the American way for a variety of reasons, because the United States was involved in the war, and there were a lot of resources that were put into it. So everything that came from the 1960s all started and stemmed from the Vietnam War. And granted, I am talking about it from an American perspective, but by all means, if you have questions or you want me to look at some other perspectives, I'll try to consider them. So, oh yeah, there's always a great movie to reference, isn't there? And different aspects of the Vietnam War. Now, the other thing that we'll look at with the 1960s, with the history of it, is what was called the Great Society program, and that often tends to get overlooked. So civil rights were a big theme of the 1960s, and at least in the historiosity or the study of the official history of the 1960s, where we tried to establish equality for everyone. And in the process of doing that, they had this little program called urban renewal. Now, that ties back in the channel because you might be wondering why we lost so many great buildings. Many of the old world buildings were leveled in the 1960s, and that was part of urban renewal. And that all came back to the concept of trying to establish a great society. So, again, it's the officials doing one thing, saying something else, and then doing something else entirely different from those first two things. It's meant to be confusing. Oh, yeah, you're right, Paulie. And that's the whole thing about it. The 1960s were known for civil rights, the conflict in Vietnam, counterculture. We'll get to that. We have a whole section on that, and assassinations of many different political leaders and leaders of other major social groups. And oddly enough, you don't see that as much, especially in certain nations. I mean, if you think about it, John F. Kennedy was the last president who was assassinated, and it has not happened since. Now you could say, well, is it because of different security measures? Is it because of the perceptions? Were they looking at things in the 1960s? There's all kinds of theories about it, and there's many different ways to look at it, and it all came from the 1960s. But one thing that we overlook is the urban renewal program. And that's where we lost a lot of our old world buildings. And the auspices, the reason for that being is that these buildings were falling apart and they needed to be leveled so they could build new modern tenements to provide fair housing for everybody. But we all know in reality that's not what happened. And despite their stated claim of trying to establish equality, all they ended up doing was creating inequality. And that's what happened in practicality, because if it didn't, then why are we still discussing it 64 years after the 60s began? Anyways, moving on. So the war in Vietnam, a very, very bloody and horrific conflict. And from the Vietnamese perspective, they were in a constant state of conflict from World War II, the 1940s, all the way to the mid 1970s. And even beyond that, because in 1979, it's a little known fact that China actually tried to invade or attack Vietnam from the north. Hint, it didn't go so well for China. But what was interesting is once the United States got involved after France's defeat in the 1950s is the way the United States prosecuted the war in Vietnam. It was very strange. It was almost as though the United States wanted to inflict as much damage as they possibly could on the area, while the stated goal was to uphold the government of South Vietnam. And then there were all kinds of bombing operations. But the real center of gravity, and we'll look at the strategy later, was the fact that North Vietnam was able to supply and support counter government forces in South Vietnam called the Viet Cong. Now, I don't want to get this into a military history lesson or anything like that, but studying the conflict is very strange. And the way the United States fought the conflict is very strange. It's really the classic example of the United States throwing all these resources at a problem and not really being able to achieve much of anything. If you've ever seen the 1970s film Apocalypse Now, yeah, pretty much. If you've ever seen the 1970s film Apocalypse Now, it really captures the whole process of what Vietnam actually was. So, in any event. But moving on from that, here's what we have for the stated strategies. Now, the reason I want to look at this is we have many examples in modern war where adversaries do strange things. And the United States strategy was to force North Vietnam to give up the war. Now, is that really a practical strategy? This was a nation that had been fighting already for a couple of decades. And so this didn't really seem like an achievable strategy. Make North Vietnam agree to a settlement acceptable to the US and protect South Vietnam and win support of the South Vietnamese. Now, oddly enough, the United States seemed to repeat this strategy in recent conflicts in the 21st century. And I don't think that's very controversial to say that. Yeah, exactly. And it's an intriguing aspect. Yeah, it's a good comment there, David, that Laos never had an army. We'll get to Laos in a second, and you'll see exactly where it is. And it's really odd that Laos was attacked so viciously. And the stated reason was because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lines of logistics that North Vietnam was supplying the counter-government fort or the Viet Cong in South Vietnam were in Laos, supposedly. And they bombed the Plain of Jars very extensively in many other areas. So it's really, really strange from many perspectives. It just seemed to be that the whole goal of it was just to inflict maximum destruction. Now, if you look at the North Vietnam and Viet Cong strategies, they seem to have a little bit more of an applicable and achievable strategy, at least when it was all said and done. And of course, we can say that. Now, oddly enough, destroy the morale of the ARVN South Vietnam Army, you can find many operations that were carried out by the United States military that actually made that happen quite effectively. Again, I don't think that's controversial at all to say, because the way the United States conducted transfer of authority and responsibility to the South Vietnamese army, it was very poorly done. And oddly enough, it was another example of strategy that failed in the 21st century in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Unless somebody wants to argue that, and by all means, I'm open to it. But so it's very interesting how that was all conducted. Now, in 1979, after the Vietnam War had ended, North Vietnam defeated South Vietnam officially and reunited the nation. China tried to invade Vietnam. A lot of people don't know about this conflict in 1979. They were in Vietnam for less than a month, and it did not go well for China, although official sources try to say that it did. I don't think they only would have been there for a month if it didn't go so well. So, again, it's another one of those things that a lot of people just don't know about. So, anyway, yeah, a lot of changes from how things actually were during that time. And you can see where Laos actually is just west of Vietnam and why it suddenly became targeted at that point. So just so much conflict, and a lot of people never understood it. And a lot of people never could understand what the true objectives were and what was the real point behind the whole thing. It was just strange. The conduct of it, the goals, what the actual strategy was, the operational strategy. I mean, trying to force a nation to give up a war, but not actually fight a war in that nation on the ground. A lot of strange things. And so that's just what came from it. So moving on, we also have all this destruction that occurred in most of Southeast Asia from the war, from all sides fighting. And it seemed to be a very concentrated destruction. And it was quite a horrifying time. And it's pretty amazing that people came out of it. Now, there's always two sides to every story. Not everybody was looking to inflict destruction, and they certainly put the effort to try to say that they were there to help, but that seems to be an all too common story that we hear. We're here to help, but then there's great problems, and you should always take that with a grain of salt. This is the Plain of Jars. Now, we've explored this before in an earlier exploration, and this is in Laos, and this is part of the area that was heavily bombed by the United States when they were trying to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and also supposedly when they were trying to force North Vietnam to the peace table. Plain of Jars is a very interesting area, and it's something that really reflects an older civilization that we've looked at a few different times. Oh, yeah, without a doubt. MASH is a good one. But it's a very interesting area. And I think there is a lot to be said for that, to destroy true history and to conceal it. And if you think about that, that was happening everywhere all the time in the 1960s. And that's a great comment there, Run of the Coffee Mill, and the fact that you see that happening in these other nations with war going on. But then you see it happening in not just the United States, but in Europe. For example, during this time in Scotland, they were trying this new tenement plan. We'll look at some of these horrifying buildings that they built in the 1960s. They were just I don't like to say too many bad things about them. I'll let you see them for yourself and see what you think. So, oh yeah, The Deer Hunter. That was a good 1970s movie as well about Vietnam. So, but anyway, continuing on with the overall history of the 1960s. So conflict in Laos, and you can see where the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran here on this interesting old map. And then the Plain of Jars being right here. So oddly enough, not necessarily close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the main lines of logistics that the North Vietnamese used to support the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. There's also the odd aspect that the United States did have an operation plan to invade North Vietnam, but they never carried it out. The concern was that China was going to get into the conflict. But so all that, and then of course the concept of culture and history, and really the glory days, at least, of the counterculture movement ended with the wonderful, horrifying. And yes, I'm repeating words intentionally because it's interesting when you look at how the 1960s started with what was supposed to be a very brilliant counterculture. And it's talked about in many different segments of society. Does anybody know? Oh, well, somebody already got me there. Yep. Charles Manson and the Manson murders that occurred. And that was really sort of the end of the quote unquote innocence and the official end of the counterculture, although some people claimed it did continue into the 1970s. So it's a really odd thing that we had with these different sorts of leaders that were cropping up. There was a lot of cults of personality, you could say, during the 1960s, a lot of assassinations, a lot of violence all over the place, and just a lot of things that were changing. Now, remember, we're just looking at the official perspective here because we have to gain that understanding with what really happened in the 1960s. And with that, yeah. And that's a good way to put it, Polly. And that's what a lot of people were saying. Now, you could argue, no, it didn't actually end, but it really ended the perception of things. And that's one of the things that came up from the 1960s. And then, of course, here we have a nice picture of some of the counterculture. Rock concerts were a big thing. And We'll talk explicitly about what the counterculture movement is defined as, even by academia to this day, and it might not be what you think it is. And some more pictures of the wonderful free love and the integration of people from across the nation, all sharing a common point of view. And a lot of people do remember the 60s somewhat fondly, but it's not like the 80s where there was this period of optimism. There's a lot of people that look at the 60s with great difficulty. Basically, any Vietnam veteran, there were a lot of struggles. I'll confide the fact that my family was extensively involved in Vietnam, and so I experienced a lot of those issues firsthand. So I know it was not a fun, great time. Oh, don't worry, Robert. We're going to get to it. I didn't forget the Hells Angels and how they were all involved in counterculture as well. So, yeah, good old Roman Polanski. One day I'm going to do a little review of the Ninth Gate. That's a very interesting one to take a look at. So, but moving on to the history, we have all the gatherings, the colleges, and the university system, which is quite interesting with the role that they played in it and the counterculture movement. And then also just how you see what was supposed to be the generation gap. That was one of the things that came from the 1960s. Oh, yeah. Oh, very interesting, Sky Sage. Sons of Anarchy was one of my favorite shows last decade. How fitting. If you didn't figure that out by my comments about Charlie Hunnam. Yeah, that's true. And urban renewal. And this is what we saw a lot of in the 1960s. And I have some stark examples. And like I said, this exploration, I'm tying it more into the old world explorations that we do on the channel, because you can see a lot of the movements that did begin in the 1960s. So, and here's part of that urban renewal. You had people that were evicted from their homes, and a lot of these homes were actually old world homes that had simply not been modernized. In other words, they weren't provided with modern plumbing, modern HVAC, and it was just an issue. It was just an issue where you had a lot of people that had to be evicted from their homes, and a lot of people resisted this, and it was all part of what they were doing with this urban renewal. And then, of course, you look at some of the charismatic leaders. We can name a few: John F. Kennedy. There were many others. I mean, yeah, Charles Manson was considered a terrifying charismatic leader, or whatever he actually was. And there were other ones: Che Guevara, leaders across the world. Robert Kennedy was considered a great leader until he was assassinated while he was running for president. So a lot of different social constructs that had never been challenged, and they were challenged, and it was all on TV. And we'll look into that as well. And then, of course, the Vietnam War being the really first televised war. Oh, yeah, that's true. And that was when that started, too. Great comment there, Eric. You're absolutely right. That was when they seemed to change on shutting down a lot of the mental hospitals. And that seemed to go hand in hand with the urban renewal, when they wanted to bring down a lot of the old world buildings. Because if we step back and we look at the entire picture, that's exactly what's going on. Well, that's true. You're right. Jax Teller is Hamlet, and Clay Morrow is Claudius, and Gemma Teller is Gertrude. Absolutely right, Random FX. Yep, and that's kind of what came about from the 60s, Sky Sage, although were they really resisting it, or were they going along with it? All interesting comments to be made. And then, of course, the John F. Kennedy assassination. And that's something that stayed in the popular minds and popular culture of Americans for decades to come. And it still endures to this day. And this is what was known as the magic bullet. And then even here, we can see some of the urban renewal starting in St. Louis. You might remember this is the Civic Courts building. I explored that during the St. Louis exploration, the one that has the top that looks like the mausoleum of Helicanarsis, a building nobody ever saw or anybody ever photographed, one of the old seven wonders of the world, but somehow they knew what it looked like, so they could build a courthouse like it. And what you see them destroying here is some of the old tenements and old world buildings. That's clearly what's going up in smoke here in St. Louis. So imagine what St. Louis looked like when it had a lot of those old world buildings going on. Yeah. And that's kind of what they'd say. Let's get groovy. Let's do some urban renewal. Let's destroy some buildings. Zool. Yeah. Funny how it looks like that, doesn't it? The Ghostbusters building. So, but that was all part of the history of the 1960s and what they were really looking at. So we see it. Conflict. We have counterculture. We have a assassination of many important figures or political leaders or social leaders. We have a civil rights movement that's going on, and some argue continues to this day, all from the 1960s. Okay, let's transition to entertainment, music, film, and television. And give me 1 second to load up our entertainment. Now, I picked some select ones, and no, I know you're not going to agree with the ones that I picked. I can't cover everything, but I tried to pick what I could that would make a lot of sense. So 1 second here. Does anybody know what TV show this is? Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, Polly, they did throw a lot of love in that. I had a feeling you'd figure this one out, Polly, since you were talking about it earlier. Yes, this is The Prisoner. Very interesting television show with star Patrick McGoogan. And the reason I feature this show is because of the fact that it is a trippy show. It's supposed to be about the secret agent mentality at the time, but it's about an individual who's a secret agent who doesn't really have a name, who finds himself taken prisoner, and he's imprisoned in this really, really strange village. And that's actually what it's called. It's called The Village, although oddly enough, it's an old world area. There were many important bands in the 1960s. We already mentioned the Beatles. This is the Seekers. They were an Australian band, very popular. And, if you're ever looking to get the tune or the folk rock song, they're a great band to listen to from the 60s. There are so many bands, though. Here I just featured the American bands because everybody thinks about the British invasion. And don't worry, I won't overlook that. They think about the Beatles, the Stones. But there were many bands from the United States. We had Jimi Hendrix. We had Jefferson Airplane and many others, the Mamas and the Papas. And I can't list them all, but if you want to list them all in the comments, I'm not going to go down in the popular culture, but music really became amalgamated with popular culture. Oh yeah, the Who. At least I forget the Who. So many. And the music really became a way to express it because people were in a state of revolt. Oh yeah, the Monkees. At least I forget about that comment that Marcy Rhodes made in Married with Children. I chased the monkeys, and one of the members of the band, Anthrax, said, and I bet they ran like hell. Oh, yeah, Peter, Paul, and Mary. Yep, that's a good one. Thanks for calling that out, Kathy. But a lot of aspects of folk rock and traditional rock in the start of the video, I tried to play that to give that hint down about what we were talking about and just to give you the example of what it may have sounded like. But nothing like the real McCoy. Back to The Prisoner. So what The Prisoner really involves is the destruction of the individual. And it's an interesting show because star Patrick McGoohan, the show was his brainchild. He wanted to depict the struggle of an individual against society. And I strongly recommend the show. It only ran for a single season. There are some parts of it, though, that are very trippy. And what you see in it is the way that the individual struggles against the controlling forces of society. Here you have Bob Dylan pictured. Now, Bob Dylan did a very interesting interview in the early 2000s where he basically alluded to who he possibly sold out to. Oh, yeah, LSD. Throw flowers at policemen, as Donald Pleasant says. So, oh, yeah, the final episode of The Prisoner, Fallout. A lot of people still can't interpret it. And you weren't supposed to be able to interpret the final episode of The Prisoner. And that was the point. And I think if you read the official history on it, Patrick McGoohan was a little ticked off about how they wanted to end the series. So, oh, yeah. No, great point on all that. Great point on all that. So, Timothy Leary. Oh, yeah. And then, the concept of some of the societal things that came up in the 60s. So, for example, it was the real first decade where everybody was into TV. There were the social and historical aspects that came out of Laurel Canyon. Now, was Laurel Canyon really a historical event, or was it something that was remembered as a historical event? That's a good discussion, maybe a subsequent exploration, because if I go down that road, we'll be here talking all night. So, well, yeah, greatest cars ever. Yeah, a lot of people still like those cars. And, I dare say that was my favorite Corvette was from the 1960s. But what can I say? Going to the drive-in theater, that was all from the 1960s at that time frame. And that's something that's associated with it. And it should be noted that the novel Dune was actually written and published in the 1960s. A lot of people forget that because they took so long trying to convert it into a movie. Yeah, the muscle cars do have a unique aspect to them, don't they? Yeah, and to this day, some people argue that there's weird stuff happening in Laurel Canyon, Jamie. And it was also an interesting movie with Christian Bale. If you go back and you watch that, that was really bizarre. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I kind of miss the drive-in myself. It's one of those nostalgia things beyond any shadow of a doubt. And here you're looking at the village, the actual village that was used as a filming location for The Prisoner. I'm trying to remember the name of it. For once, I'm forgetting something here, but a lot of old world buildings in it and a very isolated site. I'm trying to remember what the name of the village was that they used. I think it started with a P. So, well, you know, Paulie, everybody's got different tastes and sometimes they get tired of things. So, oh, yeah, Janis Joplin. I think I got a picture of her coming up. So, yeah, a little citadel. I mean, you got everything there, and that was the filming location for the village. So quite interesting in many respects. There we go. There's Janis Joplin. See, don't worry, I didn't forget about Janis Joplin. And very interesting. There we go. Thank you, Random FX. Port. Okay, you're gonna butcher me from a pronunciation again. Port Merion Village. That's where they filmed The Prisoner. That was the village where number 6, that was the only name you got for the main character portrayed by Patrick McGoohan, was held throughout the duration of the series. They do all kinds of crazy things trying to break him to get the information that he actually knows. They don't ever succeed, but the ending is quite, how shall we say, contentious. So, okay. Well, we know where you're truly from when you say it that way. I still remember that line from Robin of Sherwood. What's that wretched little man want Wales for anyway? Not to insult Wales or anybody from there. I just always found the line pretty funny. So, definitely. And, you know, here we have Joan Baez, and I remember she did one of my favorite versions of Nicola and Marge, Here's to You, and that song made a reappearance on Metal Gear, in the Metal Gear franchise. She was the one who sang the original song. Jimi Hendrix, don't want to forget him, and a lot of his songs, and the fact that he really influenced the pop culture and the rock of the 60s, which gradually led to what was innovated in the 80s, interestingly enough. And then, of course, the rover from The Prisoner. This was the balloon that they would send after you if you tried to escape the village, and the balloon would smother you and you'd be knocked out, or it could kill you and then you'd be returned. Nice old world building back there. Just a beautiful site that they filmed it in, and some very interesting costumes with the umbrellas and how they were messing with your mind in that show. Also, just bizarre things where you see human beings used as chess pieces. I mean, there were a lot of literal interpretations you could really take from the show and what it meant. And so the entertainment, the music, it all melded together in the 60s. You could really say it was a bit of a run for what happened in the 80s to a greater level with the music videos. And a lot of people say that the first music videos were in the 60s, you know, the proto videos of the singers going around on film and singing, or they didn't use film, they used video cameras at the time. But it all started at that time. Oh, what do you got there, Paulie? Yeah, it did, but I mean, it really wasn't well known, at least outside of it, until, you know, you had the what they called the Satanic Panic in the early 80s, and that's a little bit beyond what we're talking about here, but it's a very good point. And don't want to discard it, because it did happen, and it did start in the 60s, you're right. So, oh yes, and that's what became known from the 60s. And boy, we got a doozy for you on that one. So just hold tight. And I don't want to forget James Bond, the whole concept of espionage and spying. The James Bond movies, 007, Dr. No with Sean Connery, the original in the 1960s. Did you ever notice, though, that during the James Bond movies that the actual Cold War antagonists were never the villains in the series? I think the closest you came to it was Goldfinger, where Auric Goldfinger was being assisted by a Chinese scientist who provided him his dirty atomic device, because that's what they were going to use to destroy the aura, to irradiate the gold supply in Fort Knox, rather than steal the gold, because in the film, Sean Connery says it's not practicable to steal all the gold from Fort Knox. Hundreds of men would take 2 days to load it onto 200 trucks. So, oh yeah. Zardoz's prequel. Oh, that's a good one. I'm glad none of you have forgotten Zardoz. That was a fun review to do. So, but yep, the heyday of the Spy. There were many TV shows about it, such as Patrick McGoohan on Danger Man. At least that's what we knew it as. All right, I don't want to forget Star Trek. Star Trek, the revolutionary science fiction series that started in the 1960s. Although, interestingly enough, its popularity really came after they foolishly canceled the show. It came through the fan conventions. It came through reruns. And the reason I said why Star Trek really became a pop culture phenomenon in the 80s is that's when it did. Now, it grew in the 70s. There's no doubt about it. But the first Star Trek movie, the motion picture, was in 79. It did well. The fans loved it. But it really wasn't until Wrath of Khan that I would argue Star Trek became in the popular minds of many people around the land. But the original show is beloved, and I'll just confide that to this day, the original show, the original series, is still my favorite. And it's my favorite because I think it has many aspects of the old world in it, the character relationships, the plots. And one of my very favorite episodes of TV of all time, The Doomsday Machine, was an original series episode. Yes, I love Best of Both Worlds from The Next Generation, but I would argue that as a standalone episode, there was never anything in The Next Generation that surpassed The Doomsday Machine. They came close a couple times. They came close. But again, just my opinion. And I know, debating Star Trek and Next Generation is an old argument. So, I mean, and honestly, it's all related, and I can appreciate the characters for being different in the way that they are. So, Star Trek, something that started in the 60s and is still with us to this day. I mean, how many variations of Star Trek we have now? So, yeah, exactly. And a lot of people don't like William Shatner. And interestingly enough, when you go back and you watch it, it seems like a campy show. I mean, they did not have great production values, but what they did have were really good writers. They had, for the most part, pretty serious performers who took their roles seriously. And I always loved how the original series crew was depicted as being very professional. And no matter what situation they were in, they always worked very well together. And yet at the same time, they really did seem to aspire to a different aspect of humanity. And I think that was really the old world aspects in it. And remember that it was based on the character relationships a little bit more. Now, I'm not saying the Next Generation or the other Star Trek series wasn't, but that's just something that they really started then and there. Okay, got to stop talking about it. Now, if you're going to watch The Prisoner, I just wanted to highlight this episode, The General. Now, it's not actually about a general. The general refers to something else. Paulie, what's the general refer to? And you know what, Christina? It's amazing how the timing on that all coincided. And one thing I didn't provide any pictures of, because sometimes it's hard to show pictures of it, the film 2001. And 2001, which all came out about that same time frame. Yeah, I think you'll have to go back and watch it, Polly. You might be surprised. Watch that episode of The Prisoner, The General. I don't want to spoil it for anybody. If you're interested in it, watch it. If you don't have the time, look up the synopsis of it. They have a decent synopsis on Wikipedia, and read what it's about. Hey, J-Dubs, good to see you. It's all good. Well, and that's when NASA officially started, Christina, but it actually started a little bit before that in a couple different ways, especially with Operation Paperclip, and we could even make the argument with what was going on. So, oh yeah, good old Stanley Kubrick. And he definitely knew some things that he always put in his films. So, in any event. And then just looking at some of the most well-known bands. Now, that we can't not mention the Beatles. Okay, double negative there. The Beatles, the Stones, Aretha Franklin. So many others who really changed the landscape or the soundscape of it, as it were, of music. There were even some thoughts to imagine that what would have happened differently in history if the Beatles stayed together, like the Rolling Stones did. I remember listening to the Rolling Stones play at the Super Bowl. I think it was 2006, and I just couldn't help but think, my goodness, what a lifeless performance. I like the Rolling Stones. I like their songs, but I don't know, maybe they just should have hung it up. Remember when Mick Jagger was in that Emilio Estevez movie, Free Jack? Yeah, that was pretty interesting. And it's interesting because the Beatles kind of played at the cultural center of the 1960s, and they were alluded to as being the identity of the 60s in many respects. And I can remember people still talking about them in the 80s. So good to see you, my friend. Yeah, it is kind of funny how Kubrick just seemed to disappear right at the start of the century, isn't it? He definitely made some very interesting movies, so no doubt about it. And, the start of the sitcom, that actually came from the 60s with the original Brady Bunch. Believe it or not, it did start in the 60s. And you can see they still have the 60s hair before they went all 70s with the perms and everything. But the thing that really came about in the 60s was the sitcom, which we saw many different variations of through the rest of the 20th century. So quite interestingly enough. And Doctor Who. I don't want to forget Doctor Who. Now, Americans didn't really get introduced to Doctor Who until the 1980s on public broadcasting services. That's where a lot of Americans saw Doctor Who. But Doctor Who was around in the 60s. William Hartnell, the first Doctor portrayed here. I never saw William Hartnell until many years into the show. And I got to admit, it's very, very different than the version of the first Doctor I saw in what was it? The Five Doctors. That was the 20th anniversary special in the 1980s, which was one of the early Doctor Who serials that I saw. And it was a different actor. So for me to go back and watch those original episodes, it was very interesting. So, well, Random FX, I never got into Doctor Who in the 21st century. I mean, I liked the actor. Was it Christopher Eccleston? I think that's how you say his name. He was cast initially, only did one season, but I never watched it. I could never get into it. I missed the classic Doctor Who. I mean, for me, there's nothing like Tom Baker trying to sort something out, even with corny special effects and everything else. The stories that they had were the best. But okay, I'm digressing again. And then, of course, back to the Beatles. They were everywhere. They represented the time frame of the 60s, the songs. And, pretty much anybody from the 60s will tell you about how wonderful the Beatles were. And so that's all I'm really going to cover for the entertainment portion of it. Oh, come on. You must have joined us late, J-Man. You must have joined us late. Of course, we talked about The Prisoner. I couldn't overlook The Prisoner. We rooted for the Daleks. That's a good one. Yeah, and a lot of people don't know that there were a couple Doctor Who movies that came out in the 60s as well. So, I mean, it was really a big aspect of it. All right, so let's transition to the counterculture aspect of the 1960s. So one moment here. And this is where things really start to go off the beaten path a little bit. And one moment here, share the screen. And we'll actually look at what the full definition of counterculture was, because there is an official academic definition for counterculture, but I'll just start opening up to y'all. What do you think counterculture is? What's it say to you? Yeah, there you go, Kathy. That's a great way to say it. Peace, love, and hippie beads. And that's what it's associated with in a lot of respects. There you go. Shrooms, LSD, or LDS, as Admiral Kirk called it in Star Trek 4. He was part of the free speech movement, did a little too much LDS when he was talking about Spock. Blue Oyster Cult. Really like that band. I still like them to this day. I'll still play them now and then. Very interesting. Yep, all aspects of the 1960s. And there's actually an official statement of that. So, all right, let me get into the counterculture bit here, because I'm losing my momentum, and that happens because I start thinking about things and I start doing that. So a lot of public assemblies, a lot of official and unofficial public assemblies. That was the counterculture. Resist the Vietnam War, protest the war, resist the draft. It's wrong. It's unfortunate. I mean, you can even see it here. Not our sons, not our sons. Of course, there were plenty of daughters that served in the Vietnam conflict as well. And then you also have the free speech, free love, free dance movement. That was part of the counterculture. And now I'll show you the official slide from academia. And yes, I still have this, much to my shame. The counterculture movement. Counterculture, a movement made up of mostly white. Remember, this is the academic definition. This is not Lucius Aurelian's definition, okay? Middle-class college youths who tried to establish new culture based on love and peace. Ah, yes, and it's centered on the universities. At least that's what we're told. Now, is that what really happened? Hey, Raja, good to see you. Oh, yeah. And a lot of that came from that time frame, and they brought it back a little bit with the Austin Powers series, and they were looking at it. Ah, good point there, Adam Baum. Yeah, it was initially considered a threat, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Yeah, maybe, or maybe not. It's hard to say. I mean, remember, we're just looking at what we're supposed to see. So a little bit of everything involved in it with the whole counterculture movement, but that's what was remembered from the 1960s. And then you got other aspects of it, the coloring, the hippie buses, as they call them, and then just hippies piled up on them. Generation gap issues. That was something that came in the 60s. Now, you don't really hear about that so much. I mean, you still hear about the different generations, and it's interesting how we try to put that identity on people that, oh, you're from a different generation. You don't think like me. We had a good work ethic back in the 40s and the 50s. You don't have it now. Oh, yeah. Yep. And it's interesting that they had such a brutal war, Sky Sage, and that it raged throughout the entire decade. I mean, the United States wasn't officially involved until the mid 60s with the Battle of the Ia Drang, but let's be honest, the United States was involved all the way through the 60s. So, oh, really? You're still speculating on that? Well, maybe I'm just good at not divulging too much. So, Aleister Crowley. have to do an exploration on him. He's a rather interesting character at some point. And really, words matter. Every kind of division you can imagine. Generation division, color division, every division you can imagine. Social division, economic division, income division. They just slammed it hard and it hasn't stopped. And so it's a great point. I mean, just division, overall division. And that just really seemed to be, I don't want to say one of the goals, but you could say that's exactly what happened. And there's many different, dare I say, crazy looking counterculture psychedelic artworks that continue to promote that identity to this day. I always love this cover of Time here. They talk about the British invasion. The swinging city. Where's Austin Powers? And then just to look at some of the bands from the so-called British invasion. And there were so many of them, it wasn't even funny. And a lot of them, to be fair, did have some interesting and creative music. And then some of the other ones, they started to sound the same, I guess like any other music phase. And then some of the more strange art. Now, I'm keeping the kids' gloves on for this because if you look hard enough, you're going to find all kinds of crazy, strange art from the 1960s. And I'm sure some of you have seen it and know what it looks like. Oh, yes, absolutely. Centered around San Francisco, but it's funny how it got around, isn't it? And that was all that same time frame. So, and what you were seeing from that. And then, all the protests, the war in Vietnam and social crisis at home. And although the funny thing was you could argue that the social crisis was something that was created and the Vietnam War was something that was created. Now people say we had to participate in Vietnam and we're given the reasons: the fall of South Vietnam, the domino theory, social crisis, even though we started the 1960s with this Great Society plan, and Great Society ended up, you'll see what really came up. And good old John Lennon and Yoko, war is over, because John Lennon was all about peace, give peace a chance. Of course, there's a darker story about John Lennon, but we're not going to cover it in this exploration. But if you're interested, take a look at it. There's a few more dynamics to his personality than readily meets the eye. Oh, Woodstock. I don't want to forget about Woodstock, the ultimate convention, concert, whatever you want to call it, many different names. I mean, officially it was a music and art fair, and then they redid it in the 90s because for whatever reason, the 90s wanted to replace some things from the 60s, interestingly enough. So not sure what to make of that. You're not the only one, Kathy. You are not the only one. I don't think I've ever come across a Vietnam veteran who, if you ever even just say Jane and you're not necessarily referring to Fonda, doesn't get a little bit of a look in their eyes. So, and a lot of people were, and I knew several people who were affiliated, and it's very interesting how the concept and the identity changed as soon as the decade ended. The 60s was very much a product of its time. And so I think that's what makes it interesting. Little footage here from good old Woodstock and the huge concert that it really was and all the events that were revolved around it. And it's funny seeing Charlton Heston in the Omega Man, which came out a few years after the 60s, or just, I think it was 71. I'm shooting from the hip here. I'm confusing the Omega Man with Soylent Green, and he watches the film about Woodstock, which is hilarious because it's only a couple years after it happened. All right, Hell's Angels, the entire biker counterculture, although the biker counterculture split off from the main counterculture because, if there's one thing you'll know about Hell's Angels, and if you haven't watched Sons of Anarchy, the whole peace and love thing isn't exactly what they're all about. More of the rebelling and taking matters into your own hands, and that's what it was more about. But I do have a respect for motorcyclists that I've learned over the years. Oh yeah, good old Easy Riders. And look out, you never know where you might see old Dennis lurking around the corner. Yep, the 1%ers. And that's actually where all that terminology came from. And that still endures to this day in many ways, shapes, and forms. So, and I think that's, it's a good comment there, Vaughn, because that's something that's persisted since the 60s. Prior to the 60s, you didn't see this lost youth trying to find identity. Identity was given to them. And you can actually have some throwaway lines in different movies over the years where they really talk about it. So, oh yeah. and a lot of people do. And because you can respect people who are actually standing up for their individual beliefs. And, if you watch the show Sons of Anarchy, it talks about some of the conflicts with that and the ultimate tragedy that's if you're trying to deconflict how to live your life. And what have you. Well, and true. And in the show, guess what? They did as well in Sons of Anarchy with the cartel. Yeah, funny. Art imitating reality or vice versa. But old Iggy Pop. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and you can say that with a lot of different times, Sky Sage. I mean, and a lot of people are. And I think it's just, we like to associate certain things with certain people. So, all right, let's get to the rest of the counterculture. And this is where it starts to get dark, especially for this channel. So this was the library in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And this was part of the urban renewal program, and this beautiful building was demolished in the 1960s. This was one of my very early explorations, and this was a real tragedy. This is the destruction of the La Crosse Courthouse in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And this is a beautiful old world building, destroyed in the 1960s, part of urban renewal. This is the Mower County Courthouse in Austin, Minnesota. Very beautiful courthouse, and you can see, look at this dome. Supposedly this was built in the 1800s or the 1880s. I don't know about that, but okay, whatever. Get another image of it. And here's a better image of it. I mean, just a gorgeous building. This was their courthouse. And in the 1960s, as part of urban renewal, they tore it down and replaced it with this beautiful brutalist building. Ah, yes. Doesn't it just bring a smile to your face? And in the 1960s, that's when that was happening. And the reason I affiliate this with the counterculture is everybody was focused on the war. Everybody was focused on finding their own identity. The last thing anybody was concerned about was any buildings. Now, I'm not condemning anybody because, for the most part, we're still the same way to this day. Some of us who are starting to appreciate the architecture and what it really represents, we understand what was lost with that. And supposedly they founded the National Register of Historic Places as a result of these efforts, but this is what happened, and this is what we're left with, these horrifying brutalist architecture buildings. Oh, yeah, here you go. Student housing on one of the public universities in Iowa. Lovely brutalist. Again, product of the 60s. And more of them. Yeah, just so much character. And then, of course, I'll just end with the tenement project in Glasgow. They since tore down these towers in Scotland because these were a failure. So this wasn't just happening in the United States. This was the kind of thing they were trying to inflict on the whole land, everywhere. Yeah. And I couldn't say it better myself, Quantum Paradox. It is a total yuck fest because when you see these structures, and there's a really good movie. I think I pointed out one of the explorations. It's called Ratcatcher. It came out in 1999, and it's about Glasgow and in the early 70s with these tenement projects. And it even features Tommy Flanagan, coincidentally enough, the guy who played Chibs in the aforementioned Sons of Anarchy. So everything coming together. Don't worry, cross-threading. I'm not staying on Iowa this time, okay? We're already in Scotland. I'm not dwelling on it. So did a little Wisconsin, a little Iowa. I'm just saying that in all the city explorations that I've done on the channel, you can see many of these buildings went kablooey in the 60s, tragic as it may be. All right, let's go to the next one here. News and media. So let's get up our news and media images here. And this is where the story starts to take an interesting turn beyond any shadow of a doubt. Now, who is this particular individual? I mean, it says it, but do you remember who this individual was? Good old Walter Cronkite. And the reason I bring up Walter Cronkite is the fact that it's when they started to associate media personalities with the news. In other words, the people who were doing the news became more important than the news itself. And Walter Cronkite was the first example of that. Yeah, Uncle Wally, my father, as he was called to some people. I mean, just the insane concept of media personalities. It really took off in the 60s with all these people reporting on what was going on, whether it was the Vietnam conflict or what have you. So very interesting personalities. Now you may remember this one. Okay, the Chicago 1968 convention and the polarizing of America. That's a real event to look at. And people tried to talk about how the news affected that to this day. You might remember this individual. Used to see him all the time. Does anybody remember who this is? No, his name's not here because I think you remember this one. Yeah, Paul Harvey. I don't want to forget him. He was pretty big in the 60s as well. Yeah, they did. Good old Dan Ratter. Uh, oh yeah. And that's what it really came down to, and that's where you really started to see this, you know? I mean, and a lot of things of what people were saying and what they were really pushing on the news, and I'm just pointing out these media personalities as they were really big during this time frame. But not everybody supported it and embraced it. You know, different people had different opinions, as always. But I bring this up because this is what people saw the news as in that time. It was a black and white screen, and this is what they saw, and this is what they interfaced with. You know, President Kennedy on a black and white screen. Now, the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people would believe what they see on their black and white screen is real, even if it doesn't necessarily look real. Such as this example here from Star Trek and the famous one-on-one fight between Captain Kirk and Khan. Captain Kirk portrayed by William Shatner and Ricardo Montalban portraying Khan. Doesn't look a thing like William Shatner, does it? But how would you know if you're watching on a little black and white TV screen? To be fair, I couldn't even tell it wasn't William Shatner on a 17-inch color screen TV when I watched it again in the 80s. So I just show that with some of the stunts because this is what they could get away with on TV back then. That's not Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley. They're stunts. Stuntmen. Oh yeah, Kirk's famous flying jump kick. But the reason I'm showing this is you couldn't tell this on, or you couldn't ascertain this on TV back then. It was a little black and white TV. And even when you had your 17-inch color TV, you couldn't tell. Of course, now with big, huge 80-inch, 100-inch UHD, you're going to see this all the time. So, but the point being is that, oh, there you go. Exactly, Polly. If it's on TV, it has to be true. And remember, this was back when they had limitations, at least limitations that we admitted to, although that changed. Look, everything was fine with the Next Generation, right? Yeah, from that rather pedestrian insurrection movie. Look, Patrick Stewart really did get young again, didn't he? Oh, yeah. And just to give William Shatner a little credit, it looks like he did actually perform this particular stunt. And in that big fight scene in Mirror, Mirror, where they went to the alternate universe, yeah, he performed a lot of stunts there. But just going off the beaten path a little bit, that things on TV, a lot of people will tell you. And look at all the comments we get on exploration videos where people are trying to say, hey, there's a video of it. It must be true. There's a video of them building the Hoover Dam. It must be true. There's a video of the London Bridge and the interior of it. It must be true. Okay. Yeah. All I need is a video and you're all set, right? Oh, yeah. And then, you know, there's always rumors about all these different people. So, in any event, okay, I saved the best for last. The news benders. And this is probably the one you're really looking forward to for those of you who haven't heard of this. So let me get this up. And maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't. Share screen. Now, the News Benders was from a 30-minute special ostensibly released in 1968 on BBC Two as part of a 30-minute show. I'm trying to remember exactly what the show was called. But here's where this gets weird. So nobody that I've talked to can remember watching this when it came out. Does anybody remember seeing this when it actually came out in the 1960s? I mean, I didn't watch it in the 1960s. And really what this is this is just a 30-minute show, 28 minutes exactly, where they had two men talking. One man is the head of what seems to be a media agency offering another man a job. Yeah. The News Benders. And a lot of people want to call it the News Busters, you know, as if it was a different show. And in this 28-minute episode, what you have is Donald Pleasance, who coincidentally plays the villain in James Bond. An interesting look here on him. I mean, Donald Pleasance was a great actor. And here he's playing the role of this very sinister media personality. You don't even know his name. He just goes by a couple initials. And he's offering this other guy, played by Nigel Davenport, a job. And in the course of this, he admits to Nigel Davenport, it's set in 1968, I'm going to hire you for a job where you're going to plan the news in 1973. And he confides to Nigel Davenport here that everything that they're doing on the news is made up. They film models and they stage models as landings on the moon. And they even say, we've discerned that the moon has no strategic value, a comforting note for our stay-at-homes. And then he even admits to him that nuclear weapons aren't real. It's negative research. It doesn't work. I mean, it's really crazy. He admits to him that everything is just fake news, that it's news bending. He shows him a intercontinental ballistic missile with a special warhead on it called the Boy Wonder. He scares him by playing the sound, but he says it doesn't work. It's a scientific impossibility. H bombs, A bombs, they don't work. Nigel Davenport is disgusted by this, and he challenges Donald Pleasant's character and says, how could you do this? Why would you do this? And he says, well, we want to hire you. We admire your, what does he call it? I'm trying to remember. Something about his responsibility quotient or his aggressive power quotient. It's very low because Nigel Davenport shows a lot of character and responsibility. And he says that 99% of people wouldn't believe the conversation they're having. Nobody can verify that the news events that they're reporting are not real and that they're just using it to control people. Oh, yeah. And I did share it with the channel members. And when I post the video, I'll post the link if you haven't seen it, the Newsbenders. I mean, it is really, really crazy what they suggest in this 28 minutes. I mean, there's a lot of disclosure that goes on here, and you could really spend it talking about it all the time. It was a scripted show, Chassis. It was a scripted show. And it's really horrifying when you look at all the things that they discuss in it. I mean, you can look it up. Just look up the Newsbenders. It'll come up. It should be 28 minutes long. It's on YouTube. It's free. And watch the conversation between Donald Pleasance and Nigel Davenport. All the different things that they talk about. And it's not just the fact that the news is staged. They also discuss the fact that everybody in the modern world works for the idea of things. People work for the idea of money. They work for the idea of love. They don't work for the practical reality of it. So it's all very disturbing. And, a lot of people try to say, they try to backlog it. Yeah, Howdy Mikowski does a wonderful job going into depth on this. And if I remember correctly, he's not sure if it's even real. He remembers it differently. And he believed, as I recall, that they were actually changing parts of this. It's really weird. And so, excuse me, that's why I wondered if anybody could remember watching this when it came out. So, and there's just so many disclosures. There's so much symbolism that's in this 28-minute episode of the Newsbenders. And it's very interesting that practically this is what came out of the 60s. And oddly enough, in 1973, that was when manned moon missions ended. The last one was in 72 with Apollo 17. And they say that, oh yeah, there's no more moon missions because there's nothing of strategic value on the moon. And we have all these great devices and they're just models and that's it. Oh, by the way, you're going to work for us, Nigel Davenport, because we have an explosive device that's implanted in your body. And perhaps the most disturbing part about it is they even allude to the fact that there is a different element of control. There's a computer on the top floor of the building that controls everybody. Now, Donald Pleasance tries to say they still control the computer, but Nigel Davenport challenges him. And the episode ends with Donald Pleasance simply saying, you begin Monday. And if not, we'll set off the device and you will die. And that's how it ends. So I strongly suggest you watch it. And it's a very interesting note to end the 1960s on. Yeah, They Live. I've covered that. They have a lot of disclosures in They Live, but it's amazing to me how much they fit in this 28 minutes of television at that time. So yeah, could be part of it. Could be part of it. And many people have to believe in things. It's funny about that. There's a reason why I don't try to push beliefs on people on this channel. Maybe it is that computer. Go back in, I think you already saw it, What's Our Real Story, but go back and watch that episode and see what you think and let me know in the comments afterwards. So, well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. And I know we covered a lot of things quite quickly and there were many different elements to it, but I think what really comes down to the conclusion about the 60s can all be summed up in this episode, the Newsbenders. Because if you look at it, many of the paradigms that we operate by today, the news, let's be honest, many people, their entire reality is dictated by the news. If they didn't hear it on the news, they don't know about what's happening. I mean, they're certainly not going to get it from any other source. And if you think about it, that's exactly what starts everything. It all comes up with that and where it all begins. And yeah, by all means, please hit that like button. And it's good to see everybody here. And it's funny you say that, JoJo, because there's even a line that Nigel Davenport says, trackers, that's all Doctor Who. I'm for the real world. Well, a lot of people, is it because they're afraid? Is it because that's how they're conditioned? Is it a combination of everything? I mean, you can see all different variations in different people. So, but oh yeah. But I think it's interesting because that aspect of the news continued. And I mean, I didn't talk about Cronkite in the 1980s because Cronkite retired at the start of the 1980s. So he wasn't on the news anymore. They had other people. So, yeah. Who knows for sure, right? And, we've explored that. And I think I'm going to have to do some more explorations on that. So, yeah. And a lot of people have gotten off of watching TV. I mean, I'll admit I have. I mean, I don't really watch TV so much anymore. I'm not into streaming. So, just how it goes. So, what did you think of this exploration of the 1960s? You want to do some other time frames? I'm probably going to be looking into the Middle Ages or the medieval period coming up this week in an exploration. Or would you like to get back to some building explorations? So, leaving it open to you. Oh, yeah, 1968. You're right. The 4 submarines that disappeared. So, are you telling me, Christina, there's no point to do a poll? You just want me to do everything and I should just schedule it? Go old. All right. Yeah, you'd think, wouldn't it? Well, that's okay. We got more unmanned missions we're going to send to the moon, or uncrewed missions, I should say. Okay. Dark Ages, Middle Ages, medieval time frame, the 20s. Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And it's always enjoyable talking about these topics because I think we find a lot of truth when we look at the times in the past because we can see how things developed. Yeah, the Roaring 20s. Do we verify that Art Deco is real or not? I mean, Art Deco's real, it exists, but did they really build it in the 20s? I don't know. 1900. Okay. Yeah, maybe we'll look at the 1920s. We'll break off a little bit because it's not directly connected to the 80s like the 60s are, but I felt the 60s were the next point right after that. Well, thanks, CM Thomas. I appreciate that very much. Dark ages or light ages. Yeah, that might be true. All right. Wonderful ideas. Does anybody have any requests they'd like to throw in the hat right now? Well, thanks, Kathy. I appreciate that. All right. Well, it was good to see everybody this evening. I think we're going to call it, and I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Thank you for joining me.